Facebook can't leave their business alone. And so they change something every month. It's like chasing a...
I don't get on Facebook. I used to have an account with them, and I just don't get on there anymore.
Well, the church page is actually on my account.
Mm-hmm.
I'm about to have them set up their own,
Yeah.
and then I can get off because I like it for some things, but I don't like anybody trying to control, free speech.
I'm on Twitter. But you get punished on Twitter.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I got suspended for 3 days because I followed people too quickly.
That's crazy.
I was just following the people that were following me.
Yeah. That, and I don't know what their deal is, but anyway.
Yeah, one time I said about something. I said you can jump into the nearest sewer, and I got into big trouble for that. I didn't think anybody would be foolish enough to think I meant. No one would normally go jump in a sewer, but I got punished.
Yeah. There's no punishment for free speech. That's a weird deal going on in our world.
Yeah.
Say what we want you to say, or else we'll shut you up.
Mm-hmm.
And I got no need for that. Well, we're going to go ahead and start. Just actually, we have 2 online, so there's at least 5 of us. And there may be more. I'll never know how many watch on Facebook. It's too complicated to figure out for me. But anyway, I thought I saw somebody coming, but not. So last week, we talked a great deal about Solomon. We will all the way through about chapter 13. But he, if you recall, David had suggested to him that there were some people left over from his reign that were going to cause Solomon trouble if he didn't deal with them.
Yeah.
Okay, so he did deal with them, and ultimately removed all of them from this earth. And at the end of chapter 2, the last line that we have there says, "So Solomon took firm control of his kingdom," which is what David had intended for him to do. If you remember, Solomon was a youngster, really. Compared to David's older sons, he really wasn't in line to be a king. He didn't have the experience to be a king, and so his age, his position, everything about him really made it really susceptible to being overthrown.
Right.
So David was wise in it, and we look at it and look at it sometimes and say, boy, how cruel it was. But it's sort of the way God, even in the midst of bloodshed, sometimes we find ourselves cooperating with His will in ways that we might normally not consider. And of course, this is an extreme to that. But in our lives, it's the same thing. There are certainly times in our life where God has decided this is how it's going to be. There's no way this is going to change. This is my will. And so we find ourselves making adjustments or doing things that would have never entered our mind, but they were squarely in the mind of God. And so we do them. And it's like Jesus in one of the parables he tells about the servants coming in from the field after working all day, and the master of the house says, "Now go fix my supper and bring it to me." And so they get up and they go do that because that's the will of the master, and they're there to serve the master.
Right.
And so that's how this is too, to some degree. Then in chapter 3 is sort of an interlude between 2 and 4. If we skipped over chapter 3 and went right into chapter 4, it would feel like the same kind of story that Solomon is organizing and getting solid control over his kingdom. But then here in the middle, we have really 3 different sections, maybe 4, but 3 for sure, that tell us a little bit more about Solomon, because we don't know a whole lot other than he's Bathsheba's son, and that he's young, and that God appointed him king. So we find out a little bit more here, and so we're going to look at really the first 3 verses, and then we will look at the next from 4 down to 15, and then 16 to the end. So Solomon made an alliance by marriage with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He married Pharaoh's daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he could finish building his residence and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. Okay, so 2 things here that are important. David has already, in his reign, secured everything to the north, all the way to the Euphrates River, which, if you look at Israel on the map today, Jerusalem, and you look all the way up to the Euphrates River in Iraq, that's a pretty good section of land there. Okay, so you swing all the way back down to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, for a distance of about 30 miles, and then it swings all the way back around to the south to Edom, and then to the Mediterranean. So it was a pretty good sizable portion of land. But to the south was Egypt, and Egypt's border extended further than it does today, obviously, where Gaza, where, if you know where the Suez Canal and Gaza Strip is and all that, okay? So that's how far Egypt came. Solomon saw fit to make an alliance with Egypt, okay? So that you remember God said that I'm going to give him peace on every side, so that he'll be able to build the temple and take care of those matters. So this is part of God providing for that promise, okay? Although it may not have been exactly like God may have intended it, because we find that this becomes a pattern for Solomon that gets him in trouble later. This taking of wives. And then the other thing here is, he says he brought her to the city of David. And when we hear the word city of David, we think about Jerusalem as a whole.
Right.
But here it is talking about the city of David, until he could finish building his residence and the temple of the Lord and the wall surrounding Jerusalem. So the city of David was at the southern tip of what would have been old Jerusalem. Okay, so that was the old part of the city. Okay. And what had been happening is, ever since David had secured Jerusalem to be his capital, he's been steadily moving north with construction of the city. Mm-hmm. So instead of settling south, they settled north. The reason why, water source was further north. See, so he's kind of given a lesson here. He's bringing Pharaoh's daughter to the place that's not under construction. He's not moving her into the construction zone. Right. He's leaving her in that area of Jerusalem. 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 2. Then, and this gives you a little hint as to the date of what we're reading, because of the high places that it talks about here. It says, "Now the people were offering sacrifices at the high places, because in those days a temple had not yet been built to honor the Lord." So there was no place officially for them to worship. Okay. There's an indication that there's 2 different tabernacles that have been established. 1 Kings chapter 3.
I was in 2.
Yeah, that'll mess you up.
I was like, that didn't make sense.
Yeah. So there were 2. There were 2 tabernacles, one at Gibeon, and we know that there was one in the middle of the city of David, because that's where he worshipped. Okay. But there was no place for people to go, really. So they had what called these high places, and on a hill, almost every hill, there would be this little circle of stones or whatever that would mark it, and they would go there and they would worship. That's how they worship. So he's saying, now later, after the temple is finished, God says, I don't want people worshiping all over the place. I want everybody right down in one place at the temple. Right. Okay. So what this is saying, the people that wrote this knew that it was not right to worship in the open places because they were already under the temple and worshiping there. So he's saying that that's where the people offered, but it was allowed because there was no temple. So Solomon demonstrated his loyalty to the Lord by following the practices of his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. So David did it in the tent, the tabernacle, but Solomon has chosen to be out in the open doing this, okay?
So they were allowed to do it in the open.
Not after the temple. But before the temple, they were.
So once the temple was built, they had to do it in the temple.
Yeah.
Yeah, they couldn't do it anywhere
So
else.
how does that differ from Abraham?
Abraham worshipped out in the open
Yeah.
because he didn't have anything else. Abraham would find a spot, stack a bunch of rocks on each other,
Right.
and call it an altar and
So is that
worship the
because he
Lord.
really didn't live in a city, he kind of lived by himself?
Well, I guess, yeah, he was definitely nomadic, so he wouldn't have had anything. Then later, of course, God gives instruction to Moses about the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and that's where they did all of their worship. But then by this time,
So that's how that started?
yeah, that's how the tabernacle came about, was God willed it to come about. Well then, now we've gotten to this fuzzy area with the tabernacle where there's actually two of them, most scholars believe. One in Gibeon, one in Jerusalem. So there's just kind of this gray area, like God said, oh, well, okay, till we get this temple built, I'm gonna accept all of it, you know. So it says, then the king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for it had the most prominent of the high places. So this was like, there's having a bunch of little churches, but then you got the mega church. It was the most well known and the most, maybe could have more people there. Hey. So it says Solomon would offer up to 1,000 burnt sacrifices on the altar there. And when we hear numbers like 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, that probably wasn't that many. Those were inflated numbers, but they were done for lots of different reasons. They would provide numbers like that to give a sense of grandeur to the person that's making the sacrifice. Sometimes it's just a matter of the language gets translated in, one way or the other, and it messes up the number. Because it takes a very long time for 1,000 sacrifices to be offered. Okay.
This might have been a high number that they didn't really count,
Just a whole lot of them. Yeah. And that may have been what the original language meant, and somewhere along the line we made it into 1,000. Interpreters did, translators did. So in 1 Kings chapter 3.
Now the sacrifice, they did this all the time, killing animals
Yes. Yeah.
to God, and God wanted that. He didn't eat the animals.
Yeah, so this is, let me kind of slow down here and explain some of that. So while they were in the desert, wandering around because they had disobeyed God and he was trying to rescue them and bring them to a place. And so this is the way that he chose to deal with their worship. Okay. So the base problem between us and God is that we have sin on us. We can do something about our sin on our own through sacrifice, but almost the second after we do it, we've set ourselves up again to sin. Okay? And so God chose to use the blood of an animal as the means of cleansing us from our sin. And the reason why that is because God instructs him that there's life in the blood. And so what God is showing here is I'm willing to shed life's blood for you to be cleansed. So they understood the preciousness of it because there were several times a year where they would make sacrifice, and it had to be their very best animal.
Okay.
So for herd people, that was asking a lot. That's like going to the racetrack and telling the guy that just won a race and he's got a $6 million horse out there, you got to give up that horse
overshoot it.
Yeah, and you're doing it for no other reason than God wants it that way.
Okay.
A lot of people wouldn't do that today,
Right.
but then that was the way it was done. Yeah, and so this happened as the temple came to be. There were sacrifices going on every day because the law of Moses required certain sacrifices for certain things that would happen in your life or certain times of the year where the whole nation would come and offer sacrifices together. So it was a really big part of their relationship to God. It sounds barbaric to us.
Right.
Yeah. And we weren't the only culture. The Hebrew people weren't the only culture that did this. Almost every culture had some sort of sacrificial system. And didn't mean exactly what it meant to the Hebrew people. It was more to appease God, and God. The law makes it pretty clear that what God is after is a cleansing for us, which is significant on the world stage. How y'all? Take a breath now and say hello. So, one night in Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream. God said, "Tell me what I should give you." Now, that's a pretty good dream. God shows up and says, "Hey, it's Christmas. Ask me for anything you want." Okay? Solomon replied, "You demonstrated great loyalty to your servant, my father David." So he's speaking of God's loyalty to David. There's no way for him to speak of David's loyalty to God, is there? No, because we've already went through the whole story of David. And he's not the perfect human being. He did some things that offended God. But God had already made up his mind that it was going to be in spite of all those things. You're my choice. Your line is going to be my choice. Mm-hmm. So that is what Solomon is talking about here. He says, "You've demonstrated great loyalty to my servant David, as he served you faithfully, properly, and sincerely, although imperfectly. You have maintained this great loyalty to this day by allowing his son to sit on his throne." So Solomon understands his station in life. He knows that he hasn't earned what he's gotten. He says, "Now, O my God, you have made your servant king in my father's David's place, even though I am only a young man and inexperienced." So not only does he understand how he got to where he is, he also understands that he's very vulnerable in the place where he is. He's a young man and he's inexperienced, and he is at this time easily king over probably the largest nation around, other than maybe Egypt. And that was just landmass, not wealth. This is a wealthy people by now. So he understands that he needs God. That's what he's saying here. You've been loyal to David. You've placed me here in his place. I'm young and I'm inexperienced. So he says, "Your servant stands among your chosen people. They are a great nation that is too numerous to count or number." So when we hear that line, talking about Abraham earlier, we're getting carried all the way back to the Abrahamic covenant. That's what God told to Abraham. You're going to be a great nation, and your people are going to be more numerous than the stars in the sky and the sand on the sea. All right, so he's tying in this one line, really, in this one little oration that he has here, he's tying his whole history together with God. Then he goes on, verse 9. "So give your servant a discerning mind, so that he can make judicial decisions for your people and distinguish right from wrong." So when God first chose Saul to be king and then David to be king, he was looking for a savior who would care for his people. Okay? So we never hear that said about Solomon, But the very thing that he asked for is the very thing that is required of taking proper care of people. Is being able to see them clearly, to know them clearly, to help them make proper decisions, to settle their disputes, to bring peace. Mm-hmm. The whole point of God's union with man in this, union with these people, is so that peace is known. Peace between him and the people, and peace in their lives with one another. That's why when he says that they're to be a nation of priests, when he told them that in the wilderness, what he meant was, you're going to establish my peace amongst people. Pretty good. So it says, otherwise no one is able to make judicial decisions for this great nation of yours. So he just wants to be wise so that he makes good choices and helps them make good choices, and there's peace. The Lord was pleased that Solomon made this request. God said to him, because you asked for the ability to make wise judicial decisions, and not for long life, riches, or vengeance over your enemies, I grant your request and give you a wise and discerning mind, superior to that of anyone who has preceded or will succeed you. So this is what this is the words that are usually ringing in his ears from people. Oh Lord, give me a long life, make me rich, and defeat my enemies, even kill them if you decide you want to do that. I mean, that's what he's saying, most kings that I hear from, that's what they're wanting all the time. Okay, but you've asked for something totally different. All right, so this is so important because there was kind of a given rule in the world at this point, which Sunday we'll talk about a lot. I'm going to be in Job for the next few weeks, and so one of the things that the world lived by is if you're a good person, good things happen to you. If you're a bad person, bad things happen to you. If you do good things will happen to you. If you do bad things will happen to you. Okay, it sounds like karma, huh? Today, karma. Yeah, that's exactly what karma is. Okay, so that was the rule that was at work. So if you ask God for that, you're just kind of steering God into the rule that's already there. So if I've got the rule working for me already, and I've got God that's on my side in the process, I can't lose. See, and that's the way it was often thought of. So if I could just use God a little bit to get this rule to work for me. Of course, we find out in Job that the rule's not there. It doesn't work. And we'll get into that Sunday. But here he's saying, no, I think there's something more important for God's people than my wealth, my long life, and vengeance over my enemies. So finally, see, we have this focus from Solomon that is squarely on God's people. And that's where God has been building this line of kings until right now. David had his problems. David spent a lot of time having to deal with his own problems. I mean, most of the story we read of David was dealing with his problems that he created on his own. All right, so God said, you know what? We're past that. I'm giving your son peace all around. He's going to be the one to build my temple, and things are going to be different. And Solomon has begun that by saying, I don't want the same old request from you, God, that's about what I need and what I want and what's going to give me something. I want what I can have from you that's going to truly benefit your people. Wisdom. Okay. When we look at the word wisdom, we discover that it's not just knowledge. It's being able to bend to God's will in every situation. It's an acknowledgement and a bending to his will. So a person that is wise possesses nothing other than a discerning heart and mind that is able to bend to the will of God. And that's where wisdom is. When we speak of Jesus as being the Word, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And we're talking about a bending to God's will to accomplish what it is. And so out of Christ comes everything. That's the will of God. Okay. So it's the same thing here. And Solomon is asking for that and receiving that. He says, furthermore, I am giving you what you did not request. All right? So he chose wisely, as it is in the old Indiana Jones movie. Choose wisely, my friend. And he chooses the right cup. But he says, furthermore, I'm giving you what you did not request, riches and honor, so that you will be the greatest king of your generation. Now, big if in number 14. If you follow my instructions by obeying my rules and regulations, just as your father David did, then I will grant you long life. So he says,
kind of ironic to say that.
it is kind of ironic. But see, that's where we have to, we can look square on at David and God's relationship and still not see the whole thing. Aren't you glad that when people look at you, and I know I am, when people look at me, they're not seeing the whole relationship I have with God. It's my job to try to reveal that, but there's some days where I'm thinking, man, if they're judging my relationship with God for how they see me, they're not, hope that's not what establishes God's relationship with me. And that's some of what it is with David. There were things going on with David and God that were special to David and God. So he's going to give him riches and honor, but for long life, he's got to be like David. He's got to be able to have that kind of devotion to God, even in the midst of his own sin and suffering. David really never turned his back on God, and God never turned his back on him. Solomon then woke up and realized it was a dream. He went to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant. Okay, so this is in the tent that David had set up. You remember he brought the ark back, and wrong people touched it and they died, and they didn't know what to do for 3 months till they finally figured out how they were going to get it into town. Okay, this is that covenant. So he goes in and he stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, offered up burnt sacrifices, presented peace offerings, and held a feast for all his servants. So there's a movement here of Solomon. The section starts out, he's on the highest hill he can find with the biggest audience he can find, offering this just immense amount of sacrifices because he's king. And he wants everybody to know that that's how the king is going to worship. He has this very intimate encounter with God in a dream, okay, where he actually gets more than he's ever asked for, okay, and he realizes that I need to give God the attention of my heart in a way that I didn't do before. So he goes to this intimate place. The tabernacle, you could take 2 of these rooms and put them together, and that's how big it is. Okay, so this is a small space, very intimate, and God was there. Now see, that's a remarkable thing, because we're given so much more on this side of the cross. Where's the quiet place where you go to offer worship to God? Here. This is the temple. That's wild. Okay. And so that's what he does. He goes to the tabernacle there. He makes and he worships God there before the ark. And then he held a feast for all his servants, which is a lot of servants. We'll see here in a minute when we get to chapter 4. There's an estimate. There's about 30,000 people that are serving in what would be called the palace district of Jerusalem. Okay, it's a lot of people. A lot of taxes being collected. You know what I mean? Okay. So then we know this famous story about Solomon and the baby, right? Everybody knows the story about Solomon and the baby. It says, then out of nowhere, then. Whenever you see the word then in the Hebrew, it could be just, oh, and by the way, listen to this story. This is a great story. That's what it means a lot of times. Listen to this one. 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. I always get tickled at that because we just read past 2 prostitutes like every culture had prostitutes. And It's like if it's just a normal everyday part of life. I got tickled at the state capitol. When was it? About 3-4 weeks ago, they were trying to legalize the sex trade in Louisiana, and the woman that offered it finally, she withdrew it. I think she meant to withdraw it the whole time. She was just trying to make a point, I guess. I don't know. But when you look back in history and you start, there's 2 commentaries I wrote, and every culture had prostitutes, just as a normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill thing. So anyway, there's 2 of them here, and they came to the king and stood before him. Isn't it interesting that the first judgment we hear about the king making is for prostitutes? I just find the whole thing fascinating. Why couldn't it have been landowners or some legal issue or something like that? But we come to this thing where it's these prostitutes, but they're dealing with nothing less than a life. Okay, so they elevate this to the highest degree possible from the lowest place possible. From our point of view, but probably not from theirs. It was just normal.
Do you think it's because other issues might be more cut and dry, and this one is out of the ordinary, so it kind of stands out?
Well, maybe. I think the reason why it's retold the way it is because he's so brash in his
Decision.
way to deal with it. Well, let's just cut the baby in 2. You can have half. You can have half. Y'all can go on your way. And we would hear something like that today and think that's pretty absurd. Somebody needs to make a decision. Okay? And we want the ruler to make the decision. We want our judge to make the decision. Well, Solomon allows the greatest stakeholder to make the decision. He recognizes that the one that has the highest stake is going to make the right decision because they don't want to lose what's precious to them. Okay. If every person dealt with their problems today that way, especially when it comes to children or family or people that you deal, especially dealing with people, if you held that to the highest value, you were the highest stakeholder in that, things would probably be different. But so these women said, "My master, this woman and I live in the same house." So they live in a brothel together. "I had a baby while she was with me in the house. Then 3 days after I had my baby, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one else in the house except the 2 of us. This woman's child suffocated during the night when she rolled on top of him. She got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while your servant was sleeping." So she's got a pretty good story for somebody that was asleep when all this was happening. "She put him in her arms and put the dead son in my arms. I got up in the morning to nurse my son, and there he was dead. But when I examined him carefully in the morning, I realized it was not my baby. The other woman said, 'No, my son is alive, your son is dead.' But the first woman replied, 'No, your son is dead, my son is alive.' Each presented her case before the king." So obviously we have somebody here that's not telling the truth. Okay. That's what fills up courthouses every day in America. Somebody not knowing how to tell the truth. So the king said, "One says, 'My son is alive, your son is dead,' while the other says, 'No, your son is dead, my son is alive.' The king ordered, 'Give me a sword.' So they placed a sword before the king. The king then said, 'Cut the living child in 2 and give half to one and half to the other.' The real mother spoke up to the king, for her motherly instincts were awakened." Let me see what that, I want to see. In the Hebrew, it would read more like this: "For her compassion grew warm for her son." So wrapped up in the middle of this is sincere compassion for what is about to happen. She can't stand the thought that her son is going to be killed. "My master, give her the living child. Whatever you do, don't kill him." But the other woman said, "Neither one of us will have him. Let them cut him in 2. Doesn't sound like a mother very much, does it? The king responded, give the first woman the living child. Don't kill him. She is the mother." The first one in this exchange, by the way, not the first one that spoke before.
Yeah, I was going to say, it doesn't
You-
differentiate between who got it.
Yeah, well, in the Hebrew it does by just the form of the nouns and the verbs, but we lose it in the English. So give the first woman the living child, don't kill him, she's the mother. When all Israel heard about the judicial decision which the king had rendered, they respected the king, for they realized that he possessed divine wisdom to make judicial decisions. So they're understanding, okay? So what Solomon had asked for is now demonstrated in the story, but it goes beyond just being able to make having a wise and discerning mind. The people that he is to shepherd are beginning to realize God's with him. This is the kind of wisdom that doesn't just conjure up out of a man. God's provided this for him. So this was a word, at the end of this is a great word of comfort for the people to know that God, even though our King David is gone, and this inexperienced young boy has been made king, okay, God's with him still, just like he was with David. Okay, so we can kind of take a sigh of relief and know that, okay, this thing that he's doing with the Pharaoh's daughter, that's not going to cause us problems. God's in the midst of all these decisions. This thing that he's done here today proves that. And that is, there's nothing, I think, more important for a king that serves God, or anyone that serves God for that matter, than to have the people around them know that God is at work here. And if as long as we can see that is going on, then we can get behind him and respect him and expect things to be okay. Not that things are going to be okay because Solomon does good things and so good things are going to happen. We find out that Solomon doesn't always do good things, but good things keep happening. And the reason why is God's already decided. Okay, so there's a divine activity that's at work behind all of these things, but now it's even included into what Solomon is doing. So you pick up on any of that in your own life, where when you're walking with God and you know it and everybody knows it, that things just kind of seem to just go better. There seems to be a clearer understanding of what should happen. There's certainly a clearer understanding when things go wrong. That the only way that really happens is to get kind of out of step with God in that. So one of the things I talk to my family care ministers about is that very often we get busy, and we get so busy, and we get tied up in the minutia, because the busier you get, you really wind up having to give more attention to the smaller things, because that's where it's kind of like driving a motorcycle at 100 miles an hour. You can hit a pothole and be okay, but you hit a little rock in the road like that, and it'll send you flying. So we get to moving faster and faster, and we really can't take care of life. And the whole time God moves at about 3 miles an hour, because he knows that's about the speed that we operate at. We can't. We try to go faster, but we can't. And so Solomon was learning that he's going to move at the pace of God in these things. Okay. Now later, that changes, because he starts making alliance after alliance with these other countries, and really becomes more dependent upon them than what God's doing, and in the process has all these different pagan wives that begin to have influence on these 35,000 people that are a part of his court. See, and that begins to take its toll. All right, chapter 4, like I said earlier, is really the continuation of chapter 2. So chapter 3 was kind of this interlude that allows us to see more clearly this man Solomon. So chapter 4 is really more about organizing. And I'm not even going to look at much of it, because that's really what it is, especially through the first 19 verses. And the way that he's organizing this thing is he's got people in charge of, we'll just look through it. He's got priests, okay? Azariah is his priest. Then he has the sons of Shisha, who wrote down what happened. These are the official recorders. So everything that happened back then in the king's court, there was somebody there writing down every word that was said. So we just think that, Facebook eavesdrops on us. All the royal palace had somebody there. If it was the king or somebody made decisions for the king or acted on behalf of the king, every word that came out of their mouth was written down. So when they do these archaeological digs, you'll find the craziest stuff written down in some of this stuff because they wrote down everything. If he said to one of the servants, "Go get me a plate of grapes and a pomegranate," it's written down somewhere. And they would find these little clay tiles. They're about a 3x5 or 5x7 size, and they would sit there and write on those clay tiles, scribble in the clay, and then they'd bake them, and they were put away cataloged away in libraries. So if somebody wanted to go back and say, "Wait, what did the king say?" There was a librarian that knew right where to go to find out what the king said on that day. That's why dates were important. Everybody kept track of dates and times because there was often a need to go back and verify things like that. Nutty, huh? So that's what a recorder did. Then he made Benaiah the commander of the army. Azariah was the supervisor of the district governors. So there were 12 district governors, all right? And these guys were in charge of collecting the taxes, basically. All right. 12 district governors appointed throughout Israel who acquired supplies for the king and his palace. Each was responsible for 1 month of the year. And so these were their names, and he lists all the names there all the way from verse 8 down to 19. So you would think, all right, he's got 12 governors, divide the country into 12 districts, and each governor every month would collect in his district and send that. Well, that would seem efficient, but it may not be wise, because now he's got 12 people that know everything that's going on in his country. All right? Instead of one person knowing what's going on in a little section of his country, he's got 12 people that travel during their month. They go through the whole nation, collecting supplies and collecting taxes, and they're seeing what's going on, and they go back, and part of their job is they tell the king, this is what's going on in your nation, not just the little spot that I'm in. So you got to see your world through in an environment that was outside your own that you get really used to, and we benefit from that. That's why we like to travel. We stay in the same place long enough, and there's nothing stimulating much about it. And when you travel, then that's stimulating, and you come back home and there's some stimulating things. So it's a wise way to do it. So he goes all the way through that, okay? And then he gets to Solomon's wealth and fame. We're just going to look through this. The people of Judah and Israel were as innumerable as the sand on the seashore. Okay, what's that sound like? Going back to the Abrahamic covenant again. They had plenty to eat and drink and were happy. So that's the summary statement of what's going on here. There's the covenant that God made with Abraham is being fulfilled, and they're at peace. Is what that means. They got plenty to eat, and they're happy. They're not having to. In fact, it goes on to say. I think it's on down here. But in Micah where it says in Isaiah that every man will sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and they won't make war anymore. They're gonna pound their swords into plowshares, and it'll be at peace. And that's kind of what he's describing here. So when Isaiah and Micah hearken back to that, they're looking back to this really golden age that's going on here. Solomon ruled all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. These kingdoms paid tribute to Solomon's subject throughout his lifetime. Each day, Solomon's royal court consumed 30 cores of finely milled flour, 60 cores of cereal, 10 calves fatted in the stall, 20 calves from the pasture, and 100 sheep, not to mention rams, gazelles, deer, and well-fed birds. So some smart guy figured out how much flour this is and how much meat by the pound this would have been, and it feeds about 35,000 people a day. That's a lot of folks. His royal court was so large because he ruled over all the kingdoms west of the Euphrates River. That means from central Iraq, from Tipsah to Gaza. So Gaza is all the way down to the southern side of Jerusalem or Israel. So that's a big old section of land. He was at peace with all his neighbors. All the people of Judah and Israel had security. Everyone from Dan to Beersheba enjoyed the produce of their vines and fig trees throughout Solomon's lifetime. And that's a way of saying they had everything they needed and they were at peace. Solomon had 4,000 stalls of his chariot horses and 12,000 horses. Now
40,000.
Yeah, you just says 40. Yeah, that's one of those exaggerated numbers again. Because actually, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls that we can thank for clearing some of this up. So anyway, it would have said 40,000. Did it say 120,000?
12,000 horsemen.
4,000 and 12,000 chariot horses?
The Holman version. It says 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so even the numbers don't make sense even in the...
What version you got?
Yeah, this is the New English translation.
USB.
The district governors acquired supplies for King Solomon and all who ate in his royal palace. Each was responsible for 1 month a year. They made sure nothing was lacking. Each one also brought the assigned location his quota of barley and straw for the various horses. So one of the things that we have to point out is that you have this huge country, and it's supplying the central concern that's expressed here is Jerusalem and the people that live there. Okay, if you got 35,000 people living in an area like that, and really there's no farming in there, they all have responsibilities in the court. This was the only way that this would have worked. But everybody's happy with it because everybody has enough. Okay? And why do they have enough? Because God's making sure they have enough. All right? So it all goes back to this allowing God to have his way. And things are going to turn out okay. All right? Now that's not to be removed from the corporate idea of life together as a nation. That may not work for us individually. I'm just going to let God have his way in my life and everything's going to be okay. Well, that's not how it works. I don't think that's how it's worked for any of us in this room, see. But God's intention for this period of time was for his people to enjoy this kind of provision and peace because they've allowed him to be God. And I do think that carries forward into today. When the church of God allows for the provision of God and the peace of God to rule, then we're able to accomplish and be the people that he made us to be. Anyway, I lost my place. Oh, here we go, verse 29. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great discernment. It sounds like we're repeating ourselves now here, right? Well, if you remember, we've talked about this before. This is the way for a Hebrew writer to reiterate the important portions of what he's trying to communicate. He'll say the same thing in 3 different ways so that you're not going to forget it. All right? So, and it begins with God gave. So each time we get into one of these repetitive things, we look and Usually God's in the mix. Maybe not directly mentioning his name, but his presence is in some sort of way acknowledged. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great discernment. The breadth of his understanding was as infinite as the sand on the seashore. So now the writer has moved the Abrahamic covenant of what God had promised about his people. It's now being said, it says, this is, his wisdom was not unlike the same kind of promise and covenant God made to Abraham. It's just that vast. It's that secure. It's infinite. Solomon was wiser than all the men of the East and all the sages of Egypt. It's already said that he was the wisest man of his generation, and this is just a fleshing out, or the details of that. He was wiser than any man, including Ethan, the Ezrahite, or Haman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol. So these were obviously people that were known to be wise. And what's interesting is that none of them are from the Hebrew-speaking world. These are not Hebrew names. So what the writer is doing, he says, you can take this internationally across the borders, and you'll find that he truly is the wisest man of his generation. He was famous in all the neighboring nations. He composed 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. All right, now you're going to get some stuff I bet you didn't know about old Solomon. He produced manuals on botany, describing every kind of plant, from the cedars of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows on walls. He also produced manuals on biology, describing animals, birds, insects, and fish. People from all nations came to hear Solomon's display of wisdom. They came from all the kings of the earth who heard about his wisdom. So, the very thing that Solomon asked for, he got in spades. He got more than he ever asked for.
And that's just decision making.
Yeah. So it's a demonstration of God's what?
Power.
His power.
His bounty.
Yeah, his extravagance. Yeah, man, he's extravagant when we ask him for something, and it's sincere and it's for the right reasons. He's extravagant in the way that he meets that. He says, I just want to be able to make good decisions for your people. And God says, hey, it's going to be more than that. You're going to be the wisest guy in the neighborhood. Everybody's going to want to come hear you just talk. And that's what it says here at the end, is that people would come from all over just to hear what he had to say about certain things. So, to me, that's an interesting sidebar in the story that the writer certainly wants us to uncover. You know, he's not just telling a story to build up Solomon, because later he does a pretty good job of telling what went wrong with Solomon. What he's doing is he's building up a story of God and what God is doing in this life of Solomon. And we're able to see it on grand display on the world stage, so that it's unmistakable as to what's happening. Interesting for me, anyway. That these little stories that kind of creep out of Scripture sometime can hold so much lessons for us. Any comments about any of that?
I haven't heard too many people reference verses about his knowledge about wisdom or his knowledge about birds.
Everything.
No,
They just go to like his decision making.
I've probably speed read the Old Testament 4 or 5 times. I've never given it the kind of attention I'm doing now, and I never remember reading this ever. I've read it like 5 times. That's how bad my brain is.
Well, it's just like
I never studied it, so I just went right in here and out. And
it's probably like a lot of other people. Though. It's like you notice the big, I guess, so-called flashy story, the 2 prostitutes with a baby, and
yeah, everybody likes that story.
you don't you don't never really hear anybody talk about.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, he talked about everything though.
And the thing about it is you don't hear anything like that prior to him. There's no one in Israel's past,
He's talking about plants.
plants and animals and poems and songs and all of that. But why? Why was he able to spend his time doing that?
Because it was at peace.
It's a peace. God was providing peace. He told David, don't worry about Solomon. He's going to have peace on every side. He's going to be able to do exactly what he's going to do with this temple. And so he had, literally, it's kind of like, well, I got time on my hands,
Mm-hmm.
and I've been given all this wisdom.
Well, then you had other people that were, I guess, capable of doing what he needed.
Well, yeah, he was
Instead of
organized. He didn't have
just worried
to
about
deal with
everyone
the...
stabbing him in the back.
Yeah. He didn't have to deal with the minutiae of running the country. He had 12 district supervisors that were doing that, and he had a supervisor over them. So yeah, it was. He had a well gripped handle to where, although he was the most wise, powerful king in the region, he could still flourish in ways that most people just dream about. You know, he's like a Renaissance man when you start reading these last few little verses here. So anyway,
Make me wish I asked for wisdom a long time ago.
yeah. And is it Psalms? Is it the Psalms or Proverbs? That the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom. So we can't even find wisdom until we acknowledge who God is and who we are, and then it begins to come to work for us. But if we're usually pretty honest about who God is if we have any understanding of Him at all. But we're not always honest about who we are. And that's part of that word fear or the awesomeness of God. You can't really stand in awe of God until you've really washed yourself out of all that you really think is good. Like Isaiah in the temple when he hits the floor, woe is me. I'm a man with unclean lips living amongst unclean people, and I deserve to die.
It's pretty harsh.
Yeah. Instead, God touched his lips with the coal to cleanse him, and he said, "You're not going to die.
I don't know.
I got something for you to do if you want to do
No,
it."
wait, I didn't do
All right. Well, y'all don't have anything to say, and I'm
That was interesting.
talking myself out. Yeah. There's a lot of life lessons in the history books.
How you been doing?
I've been all right. Can't complain. Working myself at both ends. I think
I know. It's crazy.
I'm going to go to my dad's.